Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris and welcome to a surprise Bionicle fan review. This one has actually been sponsored by BIONICLE Iliad, which is a group of incredibly talented animators, voice actors, artists, and more who are working on a reanimation of the Bionicle storyline. What I've seen so far looks super promising and I'll be talking a lot more about it in the video, but to celebrate the launch of BIONICLE Iliad, they have sent me over a model of Kopaka that they actually use to animate within their show, which is super cool. It is highly articulatable, highly detailed, and one of the most interesting physical Bionicle models I've ever put together, to be honest. And so, without further ado, let's take a look at BIONICLE Iliad's take on Kopaka, the original Toa of Ice. Okay, so this is Kopaka, Toa of Ice, from the BIONICLE Iliad fan project. Now, what exactly is BIONICLE Iliad? Well, basically, it's a fan project with the goal of 3D animating Bionicle story in an episodic format across YouTube videos and other sites. They've already produced 2 animated videos showcasing some scenes from the first episode of the series, which they're currently mid-production on, and if you're curious about learning more or supporting them, I've linked their links in the description below, their Patreon, as well as a mock contest they are currently running to try your hand at building a lava monster with a Takua plushie on the line, which I will say is absolutely adorable, and if I had time, I absolutely would be entering because I need this plushie. However, the main focus of this video is to actually take a look at BIONICLE Iliad's version of Kopaka, which is definitely one of the most detailed versions of the character I've ever had a chance to physically play with, while still retaining the original size, proportions, and color scheme of the original set. Obviously, since this is a model that is primarily meant to be used in animation and not meant to be played with, it is very, very fragile. It may be one of the most fragile Bionicle models I've ever reviewed, and that is saying something, given that this is Bionicle fan and reviews after all. However, I will say that the fragility is absolutely a trade-off for having this be incredibly detailed for their purposes, given that this is mostly going to be used as a 3D model in the animation. It doesn't matter at all that it's fragile because it looks good, it's highly articulatable, and it most importantly captures the essence of the original character. Now, moving onwards to the articulation, we're going to be treating this like a normal Bionicle fan review, just having to be really careful about how I move things around to prevent things from breaking. I want to first start off with the legs here. Now, the legs have a huge range of articulation because obviously, as you can see, they are primarily built with system pieces, which is pretty strange for a Bionicle MOC to have mostly system elements, but I feel like it really works because they were able to still capture the very mechanical detail of the legs themselves while having these pieces be basically brick built. The knees do bend like so, and you can kind of get some rotation out of it like this, even though I don't think that's super intentional. You can get some sort of an extra pose out of that. You can rotate the foot like so, as well as have the foot be movable on the ball joint itself, so you get so much articulation just out of the legs themselves. And for one thing that I really like is that they were able to capture the essence of the original LEGO Bionicle piece, right down to some of the Technic holes being used fully purposefully integrated with the system pieces, but still actually having its own design and making it feel a little bit more solid and bulky. Now, the leg can rotate pretty much how you would expect as well. It is attached using the LEGO Bionicle hand elements, which makes total sense to have that attachment there. And the torso actually does articulate as well. I'm gonna have to be really careful with this though, because the central part is literally only attached by one stud, and these two things are kind of pushing it out, so it's incredibly fragile, but yes, you can actually get waist articulation, and I really like the aesthetic detail of these pistons being included as the candlestick pieces, which really do add a lot to the leg itself. The pieces are kind of falling off here and there, so again, you need to be really careful when moving it around. This is absolutely not the kind of model you're meant to play with. It really is supposed to be just a display model, but again, that's how the torso works there. And then the arms themselves have a pretty surprisingly high amount of articulation you can get out of them, because you have the... Oops, let's not bump that here. You've got the shoulders here, which can rotate back and forth. You can also move the arm back and forth and up and down based on the shoulder itself, and then you can actually articulate this element, this piece right here, as long as you're just careful with it, but you can articulate that piece backwards and forwards if you want. The arms are mounted on the kind of standard LEGO Exoforce hand elements, so you can cause those to bend the limbs like so, although unfortunately it can't really hold the weight of its arms with the sword because it is just a standard clip, so you are pretty limited in articulation when it comes to playing with this as a physical model because he just can't hold the sword up. The sword's just going to droop down, but it is what it is. Unfortunately, the biggest flaw with the model is that this contraption and construction right here is probably one of the most flimsy pieces I've put together. You basically kind of just take this piece right here, you let it sit like so, like this isn't attached. You just kind of let gravity hold this in place here, and then you attach everything to the back by one stud, but the slightest bump will cause everything to be knocked off, so it is definitely one of the riskiest building techniques that I've been able to put together here. Yeah, so things will just continue to fall off with the way this is put together because this is all just attached on one stud, and if you get this piece, you have to remove it outwards, so you have to fiddle with it. It's not the most ready-to-go type of build, but it definitely makes up for it because I really do like the aesthetics of it. I think it looks really cool, and again, this is not supposed to really be a model that you... Oh man, it's not supposed to be a model that you play with physically. It's supposed to mostly be a model that you digitally play with, so it's not the biggest of deals, but it definitely can be a little frustrating when just getting this centerpiece attached because all it is attached by is this one single stud, so you have to be super careful in just getting that attached up. Okay, like right there, I think that's pretty solid. Then I'll just reattach the arm, there you go, and it's good to go. So it is what it is. Also, the arms are also attached by just one stud, so again, if you try to bend the arm in any way, it's just going to detach, so really clearly this is not meant to be something that you're supposed to play with physically. However, if you glued the pieces, I wouldn't, but if you did, that would definitely make this a much more solid toy to play with, and honestly, I've never been more tempted to glue anything in my life other than with this model because I kind of do want to play with this and pose it. You just can't really play with it and pose it because of how fragile it is. That being said, oh man, there it goes again. You can still move the head up and down, so the head has a full range of articulation. Things are just completely falling apart here, but it does look really cool. Again, if you're just looking at aesthetics, it is very, very fun to play with, aesthetically speaking, and to just look at, because it is one of the most interesting aesthetic builds that I've seen out of Bionicle, but just not the kind of thing that you would really want to have as a long-term toy to play with, because as soon as you get it into one pose, I would not recommend deviating from that pose, or else you're going to have a pretty hard time with actually being able to play around with it. Let me try to reattach this one last time here, and if not, we'll just do a cut and I'll sit down, reattach it for a couple of minutes, then we can resume the review. But really just the one thing I do want to point out is that unfortunately, due to the way that everything is built together, the pieces kind of force themselves apart, so you can't really ever get a perfect amount of congruency with keeping this piece attached because pieces are being pushed apart just by the nature of how this is built. So it is what it is. Let me see if I can just get that to align one last time here. Gotta push these in a little bit. There we go. I'm gonna leave that for now and we can move on. Now, moving on to the building techniques, I will say that building techniques-wise, this is really, really interesting and really solid. Obviously, the thing I do want to highlight is the incredibly complex build for the chest here, which does replicate the mechanical detail of the original torso element, while giving it a very unique flavor. It almost feels like the grills are maybe ornate markings carved into the chest itself. It's a really interesting build, and I really do love the completely unique aesthetic you've got going on with the chest itself, where it feels like this has so much mechanical detail in it. It feels so much fun to just look at and pose around and play with. If it only stood together, then it would be a lot more fun to play around with, but I really do like the aesthetic of the way that this entire build comes together. Even on the back of the chest, you have a lot of really nice and interesting internal details. You've got these gearings on the back of the chest itself, which they were able to factor in to mimic the gear function of the original sets, which is really nice. They don't actually function, like the gears don't do anything, but it's really cool how they do actually interface with each other. I do like that as a nice touch, just mechanically speaking, for the detail of the set itself. And yes, being able to articulate the waist is really nice, and something I bet helped out a ton in animation and bringing this character model to life was just being able to actually showcase all of the different bits and pieces articulating. Now, getting this back in a standing pose that isn't just completely falling apart. Again, you may notice that things are just held on by one stud here and there, so it definitely is not the most stable model. Things are just falling off as I'm moving the model around for the review here. Let me just, come on, get this standing one more time here. I do want to say that aesthetically speaking, they really were able to capture the essence of the character itself while still being a completely unique build. This required a ton of pieces and a ton of detail work putting this model together, but I can clearly see that it is supposed to be Kopaka. It has the same color scheme, the color blocking is really good with the blacks in the right places and the grays and the whites just all factoring into a very cohesive color scheme for this model, and overall, I'm very happy with the design and structure of the model itself, right down to the fact that yes, he does have fingers, so as you can see here, you can actually articulate each of the fingers. Oh man. You can articulate each of the fingers like so you can bend these outwards, wiggle the fingers around, and yes, the accessories are removable, so they're really only just attached by one single stud, so if you want to remove the shield, that just comes off right there, and that's what the hands look like without the shield on, and the same can go for the sword itself. We're going to try to put this back on one last time here, just to get the torso reattached up. Again, it's only attached by one stud that you can't push all the way in because the pieces are forcing it apart, but it is a really cool looking model. Get the shield back on there, and then we can go on to closing thoughts. So one thing I do want to say just about this model is that, again, it is probably, again, the most fragile model I've put together on Bionicle Fanon reviews, but it is a model that is intended to be an animation build. So I definitely can forgive it for a lot of those because you're not really meant to play with it, you're meant to just see this in animation, and from what I've seen of the animations, it looks really, really cool. But it is something that for those wanting to recreate this, I do believe they might be doing kits of them, or maybe they might be actually releasing the instructions in some way. I'm not really sure what exactly they plan to do with the physical model builds yet, but I would just caution and say that if you do want to build this physically, just keep in mind that it is going to be nearly impossible for the model to stay together. It is kind of the epitome of a digital build. Like, this is a digital build that looks really, really good digitally and plays really well if it actually held together, so you can pose it really well, but it is just something you have to keep in mind that when you put this together, do expect that there are going to be frustrations with keeping things in the right pose, like the arm just doesn't hold the weight of the sword whatsoever. No matter what I do, I just cannot get the sword to pose. Maybe if I do it like that, yeah, I think that works. Like, that's a bit of a better pose, but it's, again, really hard to get it into a pose without just things falling apart. So it's definitely one of the most interesting models I've put together. It clearly is an animation-focused build, but I do like having it in my collection because it is a really interesting build. Obviously, it captures the spirit of the original, and it's also really hard to rank this on a Bionicle review scale because it's not really meant to be a physical model, so like Posability is a mix between perfect 10s and also like a 1 or a 2 because digitally, it poses amazingly, and you're getting so many unique poses out of it, but physically, you can't do any of those poses without it crumbling apart in your hand. The same kind of goes for a lot of the other points, like building techniques are really solid and really impressive, but also just don't hold together, so it's really difficult for me to assign scores to a model like this, but I will recommend that if you are curious about building something like this, if they do ever release the instructions, I would recommend you check it out because I feel like I learned a lot about the construction of the way parts fit together by building this. It certainly is one of the most unorthodox Bionicle models out there, and I am very grateful for them sending me a copy of this to review. And I hope you enjoyed this. That's pretty much all I have to say about this look at Bionicle Iliad's version of Kopaka. Highly detailed, love the amount of detail on the torso, very clever building techniques to achieve these complex angles with the way the figure is designed, just incredibly, incredibly fragile. That's all for this review. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed our look at Bionicle Iliad's version of Kopaka, which again, you can check out linked in the description below. Alright, and with that we have summed up our look at the Bionicle Iliad version of Kopaka. This is really cool, and now honestly I want to get physical versions of all the Toa because it's a really unique building style, and yes, while it is one of the most fragile MOCs I've put together from Bionicle, obviously they were able to prioritize making it a really cool and interesting thing while animated, using system pieces, mixel joints, and Bionicle pieces all mixed into one. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you do check out Bionicle Iliad, linked in the description below. Thank you so much for tuning in to Duckbricks, and stay tuned for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye for now.